Did you know there is a place on Earth designed to preserve humanity's history, even after a possible global extinction? A place where gigantic walls of ice turn into waterfalls that plunge directly into the ocean. A place where it is forbidden to die and to be born. Here, there are more polar bears than people, and failing to carry a rifle in certain areas could cost you your life. An old Soviet town remains virtually frozen in time. University students learn survival techniques before they even begin certain academic activities. All of this takes place in a small community located at the far northern edge of the planet. A place where thousands of people challenge the cold, the isolation, and nature itself to build their lives in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Today, we're going to discover what it's like to live in Svalbard, the last habitable frontier on Earth. Before understanding what it's like to live in one of the northernmost inhabited places on the planet, it's important to get to know the environment that shapes every aspect of life here. On the map, this archipelago appears as a small group of islands scattered across the Arctic Ocean between mainland Norway and the North Pole. A place so remote that, for many visitors, the journey itself already feels like an expedition to the end of the world. But the true scale of this isolation only becomes clear when the landscape begins to appear through the airplane window. Snow-covered mountains rise in every direction. Many communities were built along the edges of fjords, sea inlets surrounded by mountains that seem to have been carved by gigantic rivers of ice. Massive glaciers slowly advance through valleys sculpted over thousands of years. At times, the feeling is less like arriving at a human settlement and more like stepping into a territory that belongs entirely to nature. And, in a way, that impression is correct. Although dozens of islands make up this remote Arctic archipelago, only small areas are occupied by permanent communities. The rest remains virtually untouched. Here, the human presence seems insignificant compared to the scale of the landscape. In many parts of the world, cities, roads, and buildings have completely transformed the natural environment. At this edge of the planet, the opposite is true. People are the ones who must adapt to the conditions imposed by the environment. Nature still sets the rules. And perhaps one of the greatest surprises is that this entire landscape covered in snow and ice is technically a desert. At first glance, that may not seem to make any sense. When we think of deserts, we imagine sand dunes, intense heat, and barren horizons. But the scientific definition is different. A desert is a region that receives very little precipitation throughout the year. Because of the extreme cold and low humidity, this region is part of what is known as the Arctic Desert, one of the driest areas on the planet. The result is an environment where vegetation faces enormous challenges in surviving. There are no forests. There are no trees swaying in the wind. There are no green landscapes covering mountains and valleys. Only small patches of tundra can withstand the harsh conditions imposed by the climate. For those arriving here for the first time, this absence is immediately noticeable. In almost any place on Earth, vegetation is part of everyday scenery. Here, it is the exception. This limitation helps explain why nearly everything that supports modern life must come from elsewhere. Much of the food consumed by residents travels thousands of miles before reaching local markets. Construction materials, equipment, and countless other products depend on a complex transportation network to reach one of the most isolated communities on Earth. That is why infrastructure plays a much greater role here than it does in ordinary cities. The local airport, for example, is not merely an arrival point for tourists. It serves as a vital bridge between this Arctic community and the rest of the world. Through it come supplies, workers, researchers, students, and visitors. For those who live here, This constant connection with the mainland is essential. But as challenging as it may be to live surrounded by ice, isolation, and vast distances, there is something even more extraordinary. The very concept of time works differently here. For much of the summer, the sun simply refuses to disappear. Even when the clock strikes midnight, daylight continues illuminating mountains, glaciers, and fjords. There is no sunset. There is no darkness. The middle of the night looks like late afternoon. The days seem as though they never end. For visitors, the experience can be disorienting. The body expects nightfall, but the sky insists on remaining bright. Many residents install special blackout curtains so they can sleep. Others gradually learn to ignore the constant daylight and continue their routines as normal. But if summer brings endless light, winter delivers the exact opposite. There comes a moment when the sun disappears completely below the horizon. Days pass, then weeks, and the sunlight simply does not return. Darkness becomes part of everyday life. Imagine waking up for work without seeing a sunrise. Imagine leaving work and finding exactly the same darkness. Imagine spending weeks without witnessing the sun rise. For most people, that sounds almost impossible to imagine. For those who live here, it is simply another season of the year. And perhaps it is precisely this ability to adapt that makes this place so fascinating. Everything seems to challenge what we consider normal. The landscape, the climate, the light, the distances, the isolation. And yet, thousands of people have chosen to build their lives in this environment. They work, they study, they make friends, they raise children, they plan for the future. They transform one of the most extreme environments on Earth into their home. But that leads us to an inevitable question. If living here means enduring months of darkness, harsh temperatures, and a natural world that remains far more powerful than any human presence, why would anyone choose to live in such a place? To answer that question, we need to travel back in time and discover how the first inhabitants arrived at one of the last habitable frontiers on Earth. But why did anyone decide to live here? For much of human history, these islands remained virtually untouched. There were no cities. There were no ports. There were no schools, markets, or permanent communities. There was only a wild territory surrounded by the Arctic Ocean. Everything began to change in 1596. That year, Dutch explorer Willem Barents was sailing through the northern seas in search of a maritime route to Asia when he first spotted these lands. What he found was not a new continent filled with easy riches or fertile lands waiting to be settled. It was a hostile environment, dominated by ice and nature. But that discovery placed this archipelago on Europe's maps, and soon other vessels began to arrive. Over the following centuries, hunters and whalers regularly visited the region. At the time, no one was thinking about building a permanent life here. Men came in search of valuable resources, spent seasons enduring extremely difficult conditions, and then returned home. It was a place to work, not a place to live. But at the beginning of the 20th century, something changed. Beneath the Arctic mountains lay a resource that would completely transform the region's destiny: coal. At a time when the world depended on this fuel to power industries, locomotives, and ships, the reserves discovered here attracted the attention of companies and investors. For the first time, there was a reason strong enough for people to remain throughout the entire year. Not just explorers, not just adventurers, but workers. And wherever workers arrived, homes soon followed. Then warehouses, schools, families. Small communities began to emerge in a place that had once seemed unsuitable for permanent human life. It was in this context that Longyearbyen emerged, the archipelago's main town to this day. What began as a mining community eventually became the region's primary population center. But Longyearbyen was not the only one. Over the decades, other communities also flourished, driven by the coal industry. Some prospered, others disappeared. And few tell this story as impressively as Pyramiden. Hidden among mountains and fjords, this former mining settlement was developed by the Soviets during the last century. For decades, hundreds of people lived there. There were apartment buildings, a school, a library, a sports hall, dining facilities, a theater. Everything needed to build a life in one of the most isolated places on Earth. But when mining was no longer economically viable, most of the residents left. What had once been a bustling Soviet community eventually became one of the Arctic's most fascinating attractions. Many of its buildings remain preserved to this day. Apartments, classrooms, and public spaces are still virtually frozen in time, protected by the region's extreme climate. Today, a small group of people maintains the infrastructure that welcomes visitors interested in exploring this unique place. Walking through its streets feels like traveling to another era, a silent reminder of the years when coal brought hundreds of people to build a life in one of the most unlikely places on Earth. But while some communities disappeared, others continued to evolve, and an international agreement helped make this place even more unique. Signed in 1920, the Svalbard Treaty recognized Norwegian sovereignty over the archipelago, but established an unusual condition. Today, someone on the other side of the world can decide to start a new life here, without facing much of the immigration bureaucracy that exists in many countries. The result can still be seen today. People from different nationalities share the same territory, creating an international community in the heart of the Arctic. And perhaps it is precisely this diversity that makes life here so different. Coal no longer plays the central role it once did. Many mines have been closed. The old mining towns have become chapters of history. But the human presence remained. Today, researchers, students, tourism workers, and professionals from many different fields continue to arrive in this remote corner of the planet, not in search of coal, but for very different reasons. And to understand what attracts so many people to one of the most extreme places on Earth, we need to take a closer look at the daily lives of those who call this place home. Today, life here is very different from the days when coal dominated the local economy. Although mining still exists on a smaller scale, it is no longer the main reason people choose to live in this remote corner of the Arctic. Those who arrive today find a small but surprisingly diverse community. Among just over 2,000 residents live people from dozens of different nationalities, drawn by opportunities that would be difficult to find anywhere else on Earth. Some came to study, others to conduct research. Many work in tourism, services, or activities related to the administration of the region. And there are also those who arrived planning to stay only a few months and ended up remaining far longer than they ever imagined. At first glance, the main town seems to contradict everything one would expect to find so close to the North Pole. There are streets, markets, cafes, restaurants, schools, gyms, cars parked along the roads, people heading to work, children playing, the routine of a modern small town. But it only takes a closer look to realize that life here operates differently. One of the reasons is that this place has become one of the Arctic's most important research centers. Every year, scientists from around the world arrive to study phenomena ranging from climate change and glaciers to geology, marine biology, and the northern lights. Few places on Earth offer the opportunity to observe so many environmental changes unfolding in real time. And for many researchers, living here means being on the front line of scientific discovery. This scientific presence has also helped shape the local community. In addition to experienced researchers, hundreds of students spend part of their academic lives studying at a truly unique institution. The University Center in Svalbard, known as UNIS, is considered the northernmost university in the world. But what takes place there is far from a typical university experience. At many universities, students spend most of their time in classrooms or laboratories. Here, nature itself becomes an extension of the campus. It is not uncommon for research projects to take place on glaciers, mountains, fjords, or remote areas of the archipelago. And before beginning some of these field studies, students must learn something that is rarely part of academic life elsewhere in the world: how to survive in the Arctic. Depending on the activity, they may receive training in first aid, safety in frozen environments, navigation in remote regions, and emergency field procedures. In some situations, they also learn how to respond to encounters with polar bears. It is a reality that makes it clear how nature remains a constant presence, even in modern life. And perhaps that is one of the most striking aspects of living here. Despite all the technology, scientific research, and infrastructure built over the years, some rules are still determined by the environment itself. An environment so unique that it requires its residents to follow norms and customs that would be almost unimaginable in much of the world. And it is precisely there that the experience of living in this place becomes even more surprising. People say that it is illegal to die here. Although that is not literally true, there is a curious reason why this story has spread around the world. In the archipelago's main town, there is an old cemetery that can still be visited today. For decades, residents were buried there as usual, but everything changed in the 1950s. Researchers discovered that the permafrost, the permanently frozen layer of ground that covers much of the region, prevented the natural decomposition of bodies. In some cases, human remains buried decades earlier remained surprisingly well preserved. Since then, traditional burials have no longer been carried out. Today, when a resident passes away, the procedures are typically handled on the Norwegian mainland. Something similar happens with childbirth. Although families and children live normally throughout the region, pregnant women usually travel to the mainland several weeks before giving birth. The goal is to ensure access to larger hospitals and more advanced medical facilities. But perhaps the rule that surprises visitors the most is related to the true rulers of this environment: polar bears. When leaving urban areas and heading into more remote regions, residents, researchers, and guides are required to carry rifles as a safety measure. Not because encounters with these animals are common, but because when they do happen, they can be extremely dangerous. It is a constant reminder to humanity that here, nature still sets the rules, and some of those rules can seem rather unusual, such as restrictions on domestic cats in certain areas, a measure designed to protect local bird populations and other native species. But no structure better represents the global importance of this place than a facility hidden inside a mountain. At first glance, it appears to be just another isolated building in the Arctic landscape. But what it contains is of interest to the entire world. This is the Global Seed Vault, a kind of safety backup for the world's agriculture. Inside, hundreds of thousands of seed samples from virtually every continent are stored under carefully controlled conditions. The idea is simple. If wars, natural disasters, or other crises were to destroy crops anywhere in the world, these seeds could help restore species and preserve part of humanity's agricultural diversity. But seeds are not the only legacy that humanity has chosen to protect in this remote corner of the planet. Inside a former coal mine, hidden within a mountain, there is another equally impressive project: the Arctic World Archive. While the global seed vault preserves the planet's agricultural diversity, this archive seeks to protect something different: the memory of humanity. Stored there are historical documents, cultural works, scientific records, photographs, and information considered important for future generations. Everything is preserved under carefully controlled conditions, far from conflicts, natural disasters, and the uncertainties of the modern world. It is a fascinating idea, as if humanity had chosen this place not only to protect its future, but also to preserve its own history. Few places on Earth are home to two projects so ambitious, standing side by side. One dedicated to protecting what sustains humanity, the other dedicated to preserving the story of humanity itself. In other words, one of the most remote regions on Earth was chosen to safeguard something essential to the future of us all. And perhaps that is no coincidence, because few places symbolize human resilience and adaptability in the face of nature so well. Among mountains, fjords, and vast glaciers, nature remains the true protagonist. One of the most breathtaking landscapes can be found at Svalbard Glacier, an immense wall of ice stretching along the eastern coast of the archipelago. During the summer, melting ice transforms part of this frozen surface into enormous temporary waterfalls that plunge directly into the ocean. They are sights that are difficult to forget, a spectacle that reveals how this seemingly motionless environment is, in reality, constantly changing. Here, ice is not merely part of the scenery. It shapes the geography, influences the lives of residents, and helps define the very identity of this remote corner of the Arctic. And if you enjoy Arctic landscapes, be sure to watch our video about Greenland. The link is in the card above. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't forget to leave a like to help support the channel. And if you see the hype button below, click it as well. It helps more people discover this documentary. And of course, leave a comment below. What did you think of Svalbard? We read every comment, and your opinion is very important to us. See you next time.